They just won the double a couple of years ago, and when you think about it, I've been thinking about it since we spoke, Paul, that when Arsenal won the double, they had a physiotherapist as a manager, and they had the greatest coach that England have ever had, Don Howe. And to take a physiotherapist out of the treatment room and put him in the manager's office is quite something, It just goes to show that what is a manager, It's just common sense. They said to him, well, between you and Don, Don gets the players, that's it, all week. He organises them. That's why they hardly ever conceded a goal. And they won the double, and they had a terrific team. But they had a physiotherapist as a manager, and it's just it doesn't seem real. If it was a movie, you would say it's a little bit too far-fetched.
And then when that physiotherapist did ultimately get the sack, it was Terry Neal, who'd only been in charge of Tottenham for a couple of seasons, who previously was in charge of Hull, was only 34 when he took the keys to Highbury. And to put it into, or give some perspective, Alan Ball was only 3 years younger than the manager. And like you say, I've been giving it a lot of thought, and I think if you could roll the clock back, it would have been a better idea for Arsenal to have done that, brought in Don 12 months earlier, given Alan charge, because as you've alluded to, you guys really didn't need managing. All you needed was someone to organise you, and I think then Arsenal, with that team you had, could have gone on and perhaps won the European Cup, because you were a fantastic side.
Well, I think I always look at, and in my books, I always say that I'd be like, it's a little bit like life is a jigsaw puzzle, and the jigsaw puzzle at Highbury at that time, they had. I remember speaking to Ball, he told me about it. They had a kid coming through called Graham Ricks. He said he looks like he's got great ability, but I knew that Brady, as soon as I got there, Brady was a top player. One of the best left-sided players I've ever seen. In fact, I had an argument with Ray Parlour one day a couple of years ago at Ado, and he was talking about the greatest Arsenal player of all time. He was talking about the team that he played in, the Invincibles, and I says, well, you never had anyone as good as Brady. And I think he was an absolutely incredible player. And to have myself, a fit Alan Hudson, and an experienced Alan Ball in midfield with Brady, them three would have been just unbelievable. And Terry Neal couldn't see that. I mean, a blind man could see that, surely.
And possibly, well, I don't think there's any possibility there. But as good as the Everton trio that won the league, and really for England, a Ball, a Tony Curry, and an Alan Hudson should have been the bedrock of England lifting the World Cup as well. But again, it did go pear-shaped, because you had a manager that couldn't particularly manage. He brought you in on the 13th of December, but you made your debut against Leeds United on the 3rd of January. Was that because when they bought you, you was injured at the time, wasn't you, Al?
Yeah, I remember the injury I got, and I know how I got it. It was just it was an incredible situation, really, because I remember we didn't have a game on a Saturday. I was at Stoke, and I'd done my training, and I thought I'd do a few extra abdominal exercises, which I used to do religiously, and I was very weight conscious in them days, and I like to drink, obviously. That's why I used to have to work harder than most. And I'd done a few more extra abdominal exercises. And then on the way out, someone called me into the office and said, well, you're playing a game tomorrow as a testimonial for someone in the Stamford Bridge. And I agreed to play. And I absolutely forgot about what I'd done, and I shouldn't have played because of you shouldn't do that many exercises on a Friday. You should only do just minimal if you've got a game on a Saturday. And I ripped my abdomen, and before I knew it, I was at Highbury, and they'd never even detected it. I never had a proper medical. They just signed me with a big club like Arsenal. I mean, one of the biggest clubs in Europe at the time, with some great players, and I just couldn't believe that they didn't send me straight away to sort this injury out. Stoke were more than delighted to get money for me because they had to pay for the stand, so they didn't care what shape I was in. But a big club like Arsenal, massive in comparison to Stoke, Arsenal were on a different planet, history-wise. And there I was, signing for Arsenal, injured, and didn't play for a few weeks. And then I played in a reserve game against Chelsea, kind of a fitness test. And I enjoyed the game because it was against my old team and a few old mates of mine. And I just enjoyed the game, but I knew that I wasn't fit because after about an hour, it was like if you ever had everybody gets a stitch or something like that. It's like a stitch that gets worse and worse and worse, and then you just can't run no more. It's just like a knife that's been stuck in you, And that was what I was stuck with. And Terry Neal didn't believe me. He thought I was trying to make excuses for not wanting to play. I mean, why would I not want to play for Arsenal? I wouldn't have signed if I didn't want to play for them. I loved the club. Thought they were a fantastic club. I used to watch them as a kid. My dad used to take me to Highbury. I loved Highbury, and I loved the sport, and I loved everything about Arsenal. So why wouldn't I want to play? Well, the obvious reason was because I wasn't fit.
Now, when you did get your fitness, that debut was against Leeds, and you were up against Tony Curry.
Yeah, I couldn't have picked the worst debut, really. Well, I didn't really pick it. I was thrown in because I think it might have been a League Cup game and not a league game. And the terrible thing about Highbury, although it might have been a genius at the beginning, was that underfloor heating. They had the underfloor heating, and one side of the pitch was frozen, the other side of the pitch was soft. So I don't know how, when you go out before the game and you say what stud you're going to put in, I don't know how you work that one out, but that didn't help me. But what didn't help me more than anything, that Tony was on his best form that night. And as bad as I played, it made him look even better. Because, it was one player. There was only two players, really, that I ever played against that I really knew on a Friday night that I had to take it easy and, rest up. And one was Curry and one was Alan Ball. They were my two biggest opponents, apart from them two at Leeds. But that was a different matter altogether. That was more of a war.
Now, Leeds, obviously you had a lot of history with Leeds, and even when you played for Stoke, you scored your first goal against Leeds. So there was always that little bit Hudson against Leeds United. But what we have to just look back at with a little bit of fondness here is Paul Madeley sadly passed away yesterday.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, what's your memories of Paul? Because he was a tremendous player that could play in any position. I remember you talking to me a while back about his strength and his fitness, and when you come up against Paul Madeley, you thought, well, I've got to get a bit more stronger and fitter if I'm going to, be pitting my wits against players of his ability.
That's right. He was one of those players that in them days they used to call a utility player, wasn't he?
Yeah.
That if anyone got injured, he could play anywhere. They put any number on his back and he'd do a role. And I remember my first season we played Leeds in a League Cup tie at Stamford Bridge, but it didn't really matter because all matches against Leeds was, as I say, there was a war. And I was in midfield and I was only 17, 18, and I was like man to man against this powerhouse, and it was, he was physically much more experienced and much stronger than me, and I couldn't cope with him. And I remember half time Dave Sexton changed it around. He put me out on the wing, and he brought Johnny Boyle on to play against him. Although Johnny Boyle, he wasn't that big. He could muscle it with him, and I remember he done me a favour actually, because he put me on the right wing and I played against my favourite left back, who was Terry Cooper at the time. and I stuck it through his legs, which was quite enjoyable. So yeah, but I only got that opportunity to do that because mainly I knew after the game, my father said, look, you keep living your last time you're living, you're never going to make it in this game if you're going to play like that. So I had to buckle down and start training a bit. You know, I changed my training regime completely, and you know, I thought, well, if I can't muscle it with him, I'm going to have to try and outrun them, and that was why I stepped up my training.
And your third game that you played for Arsenal in them early days, you come to St Andrews, and you were part of a classic game that people, Birmingham City fans, still talk about to this day, when Trevor scored 3 and Supermax scored 3 for you guys.
Yeah. I remember there were 2 great hat-tricks. I mean, I didn't play that well, but it was all about. I mean, Malcolm could score. He could score anywhere. You know, you go to the other side of the world, and you know they could have, I don't know, 3 goalkeepers in. You know, he could smash them from anywhere, and he was a goal machine, wasn't he? Yeah. But the other kid, you know, he was a new kid on the block, Francis, and I can remember his pace and everything. He was all over the place that night, and he scored a great hat trick. And it was obvious he was going to go on to be some player, and that's obviously why Clough paid all that money for him.
And we were just alluding to earlier that Arsenal, you know, with probably a little bit better management there, keeping Alan Ball rather than selling Alan Ball to Southampton, could have gone on to win the European Cup. And our mate Sean said, a little bit much European Cup, but Brady was absolute quality. But when you look back at those 70s years, you know, Liverpool had won the European Cup in 1977, and then Kenny Dalglish scored the winning goal against Bruges in the 78 final. Yeah. English teams in Europe absolutely dominated, and I think if you put that Liverpool team, the Forest team, the Villa team, that Arsenal team, in my humble opinion, would have been as good as any of those given time.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we had the potential. I think, you know, I think Malcolm was a little bit unlucky because he had a very bad knee, and he struggled fitness-wise with that. And so that's how good a goal scorer he was. I mean, he would have scored if he hadn't had a bad knee. But we, you know, we had a young Frank Stapleton at that time who went on to become a great centre forward, and he was a great centre forward. So, you know, and we had little Geordie Armstrong as the unsung hero. He was a magnificent player. So we had, potentially, we had that. And you're talking about they won the European Cup. And I remember that year, or it was either that year or the year later, we played them in the League Cup semi-final. And we went up to Anfield, and we were winning 1-0, and we got beat 2-1 by a fluke goal. And then we went back to Highbury, and we drew 0-0, and they knocked us out. We should have beaten at Highbury. Malcolm was clean through with a goalkeeper to beat, and just lobbed Clements, and it just went the wrong side of the post. We would have went through. So, you know, we were at least their equals. There was no doubt about it. But that was even with me being below par. But if I'd have been fit, you know, I think we would have been a match. If Terry had been sensible enough, or we'd have had maybe a Don Howe there at the time, because Don Howe wasn't there at that time. He came the year after. He would have got Terry in the office, and he said, "Look, he's got to be Hudson-The and Brady. He's got to be. You know, they're the best 3 midfield players, if not at the club in the country." At that time, I mean, Brady was, you know, he went on to show his worth in Italy as well. He was a magnificent player, and it was a pleasure to play with him. You know, he didn't always used to pass to me because he done his own thing, but I was used to that because I had Charlie Cook at Chelsea who never passed to me. He used to go on his mazy dribbles, but you had these players. It was like Bobby Charlton didn't like George Best because George used to try and do his own thing, you know. But there's all part and parcel of the game. But ability-wise, there was none better than Brady in the world. There's no doubt about it. But we had that great the reason we would have been a great midfield three because we were so totally different, the three of us. Yeah. Chippy had the great left foot, and you let him get on with it. Bally was a great one-touch player, and I could just fill in the gap there, and just make the whole thing tick. So I think that was such an obvious midfield three. So when I got there and found out that I was brought to replace Ball instead of play with him, I was quite gutted, really, because I'd love to have played every Saturday with Alan. I played against Germany with him, and it was just, we just clicked together. We knew where each other was all the time, and I think good players do. It's like Stoke with Greenhoff. We were like telepathic, and it was like me and Bally when we played against the Germans. We knew where each other were all the time, and it makes the game so simple.
Now, how difficult was it for you on a personal level? Because previously at Stoke and at Chelsea, you'd played over 300 games. You were only 25 when you went there to Highbury. You were playing for... Tony Waddington was almost like a second dad to you. Moving then to Arsenal and being in the same situation, but with some manager that was the polar opposite to Tony Waddington, that must have been an absolute nightmare for you. And again, he wasn't doing particularly well at Hull before he got the Tottenham call, was he, Terry Neal?
Well, it's not a lot of people know. There's some things that never go into print, but it was quite knowledgeable that people knew. I was told within the club that he was at Arsenal and they were going to get rid of him. They were ready, to give him his P45. Is that what they call it?
Yeah.
And they got a call from Tottenham who wanted him for some unknown reason, and it was quite incredible that Tottenham, went down that avenue. I still can't work it out to this day. And then for Arsenal to have him after they got relegated and everything else is unbeknown to me. But the terrible thing about all this, the tragedy of my time at Arsenal was, and falling out with a manager like that was, people don't believe me when I say I really liked him. I found him a nice fella, and when I finally retired and I went into Fleet Street and I met a girl I finally married. We used to drink in the same club, and we used to drink together as if nothing had ever happened or nothing come between us, and we used to get on really well. And it was just a tragedy that he was manager, really, because he just shouldn't have been manager of Arsenal Football Club. It's as simple as that.
Yes.
Your standards, you're only as good as your... manager's only as good as his players, and the club are only as good as their manager. I watched a show on telly the other night about Bill Shankly, and I could have sat there all night and watched it. The man was a genius. But again, all he did was pick the best players and got the best out of the players he had, and he just sat back and, he knew that he had the best players, and that's why they were so successful. But he was a genius because he kept everything simple.
But again, I think that's the essence of football, isn't it? You've said this on many occasions. It's a simple game, complicated by idiots. Absolutely.
I mean, that is one of the most, I love that comment because it's true, and it's true in life. If you look at politics, and I was watching a show last night with these politicians talking about all this, that, and the other, and they never ever get to the nitty gritty of it all. They're good at going around the houses, and that's what's the same as football. If you was to walk into a boardroom after a game and they're all having a drink and they're talking about the game, I'm sure none of them hardly watched it, and they wouldn't know what they're talking about. And going back to my days when I was at Arsenal and I was out injured, and Eddie McCready was manager of Chelsea at that time, and he'd done a fantastic job of getting them back up into the first division. He made Ray Wilkins captain, I think, at 17 or 18, and he built a team. It wasn't the greatest team in the world by a long chalk, but he ended up getting a sack. And the directors come out with an excuse saying that they wanted a sort of contract out for him, and Eddie asked for a car for his wife, and it went public, and they said we can't agree with that, and they sacked him. But that wasn't the truth at all. It was a lie put out by a Chelsea spokesman. The truth of the matter was Eddie went into the boardroom after one of the game, and he heard one of the directors slagging one of his players off, and he grabbed the director. It was one of the Mearses actually, and it was a fact that that's why they sacked him. They said you can't do that. He said, that's why I didn't want to come up after the games, because I don't want to hear you people talking about my players. And they were the directors of football clubs, and they were standing there with gin and tonics in their hands, slagging their own players off, and their players were second in the league, pushing for promotion. And Eddie got promotion for them and ended up getting the sack. And then they come up with this ludicrous comment that he asked for a car for his wife. And then I think Enchilada took over and they give him 2 cars. It's like reading a comic, you know.
Well, I think that's the way the game is today. It has gone ridiculous compared to what it used to be back in them days. But if we'll stay in 1977 for a bit in that first season. You then went on an awful run, didn't you, at Arsenal? Probably your worst since 1912.
Well, we were, to tell you the truth, we were all over the place. Yeah. I mean, I was in and out. As I say, I wasn't fit. There's not a lot I could do about it. People break their legs, they're out, and people do cruciate ligaments or whatever. But that's injuries are part and parcel of the game. And if you're in, there's nothing you can do. But the thing with me is, it was an ongoing. He was trying to get me to play when I couldn't play, instead of sending me to the right doctor. But they were going through a really patchy spell, and I think a lot of it, Paul, to do with it was the players weren't happy. He made some bad choices. I mean, again, it goes back to Alan Ball. How can 2 seasons before Alan Ball was Player of the Year or something and the best player? He had a fantastic season, and then all of a sudden Terry Neal comes in and he wants to get rid of him. The reason he wanted to get rid of Alan Ball is because he couldn't tell Alan anything. Alan had won the World Cup. He's the youngest player ever to do so. What's Terry Neal going to teach Alan Ball? That was the gist of it. So therefore he had to go. And then Terry could bring a player in that he could, turn into just another player and tell him what to do, where to go, where to run, where he couldn't do that with Alan Ball. Alan Ball had too much between his ears for Terry, He was a genius of a player, and Terry just couldn't handle that, really. So what he does is he transfers him, which is ludicrous, really. It just didn't make any sense whatsoever. And I spoke to Arsenal fans, and they just love Alan Ball and what he did for Arsenal. And, he was just a magical player for them. And I spoke to Brady about him. He loved playing with him. He made Brady look a better player, if that was possible, because he knew when to give him the ball. Ball was some player. People don't realise how good a player Alan Ball was, because he won the World Cup and they see him running here, there, and everywhere. They thought he was a workhorse, and the game against the Germans where he ran the left back ragged, that Snellinger or something. He ran him all over the place, but that wasn't his strength. That wasn't Alan's strength. Alan Ball was a one-touch player and the best I've ever played against, and I hated playing against him. That's why I wanted to play with him, really.
Well, you enjoyed his training sessions at Arsenal, didn't you?
I weren't there. I weren't there. Okay. I'd love to have been there when this happened. But that I know the lads were telling me that he said one day in training they had a bit of a flare up in the changing room. Again, Terry Neal said something, and Bawley would be the one to speak up because Bawley had done it all. He'd won the championship with Everton. He played in that great Everton team. He won the World Cup. What more can you do? Now he's at Arsenal. He's a record signing there. He was a fantastic player, and there was a flare up, and he just turned around. And he said, and another thing he said, your training sessions are boring. He said, you and him, and he pointed at his sidekick, Wilf Dixon, who Alan knew from Everton because Wilf Dixon was at Everton when Alan was a player. He said, you're just so boring, mate. We come into training and nobody enjoys training. And, he said, well, and this is a typical Terry Neal comment. He said, if you think you can do better, you take training. So he said, it'd be my pleasure. And the following day, he went out, they had a training session, all the boys come in, they were all bubbly, and I said, that's the best training session we've had for so long. And therefore, Terry Neal knew he'd scored an own goal, and I think it was part of the reason he had to get rid of Alan, because there was nothing he could do that he could better Alan at, and if I was a manager at Arsenal, the first player I would go for would be Alan Bohr, and the last thing I would do is get rid of him. But Terry chose to go that way, and you just don't get rid of your best players. England at this moment in time are suffering. They've been suffering for years because they never pick their best players. Yeah. And that's what football is all about. If you pick the best players, then you're going to get your best results, and it makes the game easy. At Stoke City, Tony Waddington said that the art of good management is getting the best players. Once you get the best players, then you can sit back and watch them on a Saturday afternoon and know that you got a good chance. That's all you can do. And by selling Alan Ball, we sold one of the best players in the world, even at that age. His experience was enough to keep in the club anyway. And as you said earlier on, they could have made him player manager, or at least player coach. And just brought him along, and then brought Don Howe in and said, you take the coaching. And, going back to Bertie Mee, if Bertie Mee as a physio can run Arsenal Football Club, then it says a lot for management. Bertie Mee was obviously a very, very intelligent man. And I must tell you a story about Bertie Mee, which Alan told me. And it was Alan was playing for England one night on a Wednesday night, and it was a thing with us players. It wasn't very good for management. But whenever we played in an international, whether it was an under-23 or full international, we come back on the Thursday, and we'd always go down a pub, whatever, and that was a ritual. That's what we would do. And anyway, Bawley had come back from Scotland. I think they played at Hampden Park or somewhere. And Bawley went out this afternoon. He went into Fleet Street. He went over to the pubs, the clubs. He was a real socialiser. And he got back to his home somewhere in Essex, I don't know, over that way. And he went into this club, and it was about 11:30, 12:15, midnight. And he ordered a gin and tonic, a large gin and tonic. He'd been out since they got back to London. And the gentleman behind the bar said to him, he said, before I pour you this drink, he said, I've got to tell you something. And he said, what's that? He says, your manager will be in a minute. He says he comes in here every so often at this time. And I don't think it's a good idea if you're standing there in this state and he walks in. So Bawley said, thanks for the advice, and left. And the following day, he got to the ground, and Bertie Mee called him in. And he sat him down. This is how good a manager he was. And he said to him, look, he says, I must tell you, you're our best player. He says, you're playing fantastic. He says, you're playing for England. You're their best player as well. He says, but please keep out of my pleasure places. Go somewhere else. And he didn't give him a bollocking. He didn't tell him didn't fine him, didn't say nothing stupid, never got to the press. He just gave him some quiet advice. And that is the art of great management. And Bally said, "Thanks, boss. I'll never do it again." And that is how to get along with managers, And that was something like what Whittington would do. He would call you in and say, "Look, I've heard you done this. Keep out of there. Go somewhere else, a bit safer." He wouldn't make a song and dance. If it had been Terry Neal, it would have been all over the Sunday papers. He's going in my bar doing this and that and the other. Who do you think he is? I'm manager of Arsenal. The ego comes into it, but that's how Bertie Mee became so successful at Arsenal, because he was a man. He was a great man manager, and he was clever enough to have Don Howe as a coach. So there's a little story that not a lot of people know.
And very different to the way that Don Revie would have approached that as well.
Well, Don Revie was... we used to do that on purpose with Don. Don would have his bingo and carpet bowls, and we would not turn up. Me, Alan Ball and Frank Worthington would say, "No, we haven't come here to play bingo. We want to play bingo." My mum goes to the bingo. She never got in the England team. But... No, we wouldn't do it. And one particular afternoon, we were down the road. We went around Bernie Winter's house, actually, first, and we were standing at the bar with Bernie Winters having a drink at his bar, and he turned round and he said, "What are you boys doing at gallivanting along here anyway?" And we said, "Well, all the players are busy." He said, "What are they doing? They're playing golf." "Don't you play golf, you boys?" He said, No, they're playing bingo. And he started laughing. And he said, "We're not going to win the World Cup by playing bingo, are we?" And we were laughing. I said, "Well, that's why we can't win the World Cup, because that's what they're doing. They're playing bingo and carpet bowls." Well, Don Revie had this thing at Leeds that they used to do. He used to think it would bring people closer together. Well, that wasn't our forte, and I don't think Alf Ramsey done that when they won the World Cup. I can't imagine Bobby Moore playing bingo, and I can't imagine, Bobby Moore, Alan Ball, Gordon Banks sitting down playing bingo at all in 1966. It's just shambolic, really.
I can't imagine you, Super Mac, and Geordie playing bingo in either Singapore or Australia either, and you didn't, did you?
No, we didn't. It was more a Singapore sling, wasn't it? Really, it was. But that was another vendetta thing. But I mean, now Malcolm was a bit. He could be a little bit controversial. I was a bit of a rebel, but I was a rebel with a cause. Though I wasn't. I didn't cause trouble. If I didn't agree with it, then I wouldn't do it. As simple as that. And no one's going to tell me what to do if I think it's wrong. But Geordie Armstrong was the most placid, loveliest man you'll ever meet. I fell in love with Geordie as soon as I met him, and I loved playing with him, and I loved training with him, and I loved going out with him. He wasn't a great socializer, but when we got to Australia and Singapore, we became very close, and us three went on a bit of a rampage. And what we did one night, we didn't do nothing wrong at all. We were, I think Red Star Belgrade were out there with us, yep, and Glasgow Celtic, and we were at the game that Celtic played Red Star, and we were there as a team. And after the game, the bus left back for the hotel at a certain hour, and we weren't on it. Us three weren't on it. We were upstairs in the bar with all the Arsenal supporters who lived out over in Sydney and all over the place, And we were signing autographs, having photographs done. And this is why you go away on tour, to see your supporters. Anyway, we come down and we missed the bus, and we got back to the hotel, and he said, where you through? Who do you think you are? Where do you think you've been? So we said, we've been with our supporters, the people that follow us all over the world. That's what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to ignore them. Anyway, he didn't like it, and that was the beginning of the end. By the time we got to Melbourne, I refused to train. I said, we've had no sleep. I'm not training. And me and Malcolm refused to train. And next thing you know, he come up and he gave us our flights and sent us both home. But the crazy thing about this was that they were coming home the day afterwards.
Yep.
So why send us home the day before? And he only sent us home the day before to get headlines. And what he did, which was bad management again, was he brought Arsenal's name, he dragged it into the mud. And he shouldn't have done that. He always tried to put himself first instead of the club. Had he gone to the chairman and said, look, these are out of order, the chairman would have said, well, let's get back to England. Let's all get back there safely, and then we'll talk this over, But he thought by sending me and Malcolm home, it would send us home in disgrace. And we didn't do nothing wrong. All we did was sign some autographs for some Arsenal fans, and we enjoyed being in their company, and they were over the moon that we took time out to do it. And I can't see that there's anything wrong with that. I think that's great PR for any football club.
I would totally agree. And it was in that tour that you had a couple of private sessions with the great Jock Stein. Also didn't go down too well with your gaffer.
Well, that made my trip, was meeting Jock. I mean, he reminded me so much of Tony Waddington. It was ridiculous. He was like a carbon copy, only Scottish. And I remember he came up to me, Geordie, and Malcolm was sitting by the pool one day having a drink, and Jock come up and he just introduced himself. It was like it was crazy, because here was the great Jock Stein, and he said, "Do you mind if I join you?" And so he sat down with us, and he said, "I can't help but notice that you don't get on with your manager." And so we started laughing. We told him a few stories. He laughed. He didn't comment on it because he's a gentleman. Yeah. And one thing led to another. The following day we went to Sydney races, and I love my racing, and to be with Jock Stein was a complete joy. And I just loved being with him, because he was like a Shankly, a Waddington, a Bill Nicholson. He was a legend, but a great fella, And I remember we flew from, I don't know, whether Sydney to Melbourne or Singapore to wherever. We were on the flight together, both teams, and Terry Neal said to us, "The first class bar is upstairs," he says. Again, but like, this is a school teacher in Terry Neal. The bar's only tiny. You can only go up there two at a time, and it was a tiny little bar up there. So what he's trying to say was, you, Malcolm, and Geordie can't go up together because you can only go up in two. So the childish thing. Yeah. So me and Malcolm went up, and we had a couple of drinks, and then Terry Neal come up. He says, "You've had your half hour. Let someone else come up. School teacher again." And so we went down, we sat down, I walked through the plane, and there was Jock sitting there, and I was having a chat with him, and I said, "Have you been upstairs?" So he says, "No, Al." He says, "I haven't." He said, "What's it like?" I said, "Well, it's a first class lounge." He says, "Do you fancy half hour?" Because I wanted half hour and have a chat with him, because how many opportunities you get to speak to a man like this? And we was up there, and there's just me and him standing at the bar, and then out the corner of my eye, I see Terry Neal walking up the stairs, and he looked at me and he said, "You've already been up here once?" I said, "Yes." I said, "I have." I said, "I've been up with Malcolm." I said, "But this time," I said, "it's been that long since I've stood in that chat with a real manager. It's been such a joy to be here with him, Oh, and his face was like thunder. That was it. And, that was just another nail in my coffin. And I embarrassed Jock, and I did apologise to him. I said, "But sorry, I had to say that. But, we are talking chalk and cheese here, You are one of the greatest managers of all time, and I'm afraid he isn't, So that didn't go down too well, and that was all part of us getting sent home.
So you then enjoyed the rest of your close season, and then got ready for your what turned out to be 77-78 season, the long run in the FA Cup.
Yeah. I was in and out of the team. I remember I didn't play too well. Again, I remember we got one game at Wrexham, and I remember Brady beat him on his own. And then we played at Bristol. I think we won there. We had quite an easy semi-final where we beat Leyton Orient at the Bridge, and then we played at Wembley and played terribly. But I think if it had been a league match, half a dozen of our players wouldn't have played because they were injured. And we played like an injured team that day. And that's taking nothing away for Ipswich because they were terrific on the day. But that wasn't the real Arsenal.
And by this time, Dom was back and Dom was organising things in the league and the cup. Were things more harmonious there? Because like with the fallout with you and Supermac going, sent home, how did that early start of the season, was it like a very frosted relationship then you got with Terry Neal? Did it go worse, or did Don smooth it over?
No, Don was brilliant at that. He kind of had his own way of doing things, and to have him taking training every day instead of Terry was, you can imagine, because Don was the ultimate coach. Yeah. He was. I'm not a big fan of coaches. I don't really particularly like coaches. I don't like coaching. But Don wasn't a coach as such. He would just organise things, and he would run through things, and he would make things interesting. And if you didn't do things that were right on a Saturday, he would try and put right throughout the week, and that was his genius. And he never complicated things. He never told you how to play. He just said, look, that wasn't good enough on Saturday, or whatever, and everything he said made great sense. And it was a joy to go in and work with him. And I remember when I left, and I was strangely enough, Arsenal were at the airport when I was going to Seattle, and I just signed that day at the airport, and I was going to Seattle, and it was the last time I see Don before I left, and he said, Alan, I think you should change your mind. You're making a terrible mistake. He said, you're still 27. He said, your future's at Arsenal. He says, you just get you fit and get you playing. And I said, it's too late, Don. I've already signed. And I thought that was great of the man, and I loved him. I loved him to death. And he gave me the biggest bollocking I've ever had in my life as well before that cup final. He really tortured me, tore me apart, and that kind of hurt me. But he was right, and I was wrong, and I couldn't apologise enough. But
that wasn't strictly your fault. It was you talking to, a journalist friend, but with experience. Friends and journalists and Fleet Street don't kind of sit in the same sentence, do they, when a story is there to be written on the back pages?
Yeah, it was a complete. I never give it a second thought at the time. I used to drink with a fella called Bob Driscoll of The Sun, and this night he called me up. I think it was Thursday night. And he's talking about the Saturday, what do you think, blah, blah, blah. And he said, what do you reckon your chances of playing? So I said, I'm going to play. I said, because Don told me, he pulled me aside at Wembley and when we were training. And he said, he said to me, you look a little bit worried. And I said, no, I'm fine, Don. I said, I'm no problem. It was in the tunnel. And he said, if you're worried about Saturday, he said, don't worry about Saturday. He said, because you're playing. I said, thanks very much, mate. I said, but I'm not really worried, but thank you for telling me. And stupidly, I told Bob, never dreaming that he would print it. And the following day, I walked into Highbury and Terry Neal was seething. He said, "Have you seen the headlines?" He said, "You're all over. Who said you're playing this, that, and the other?" I said, "Look, I said, I don't owe you an apology. I owe it to Don." He said, "Well, he's waiting in the office for you." And I walked in, and he did everything that knocked me out. Really, he hit me, I just couldn't get a word in with him. He was disgusted with me. He told me, and he just said, "I don't want anything to do with you anymore." He said, "If you do things like that to me, and when I left the dressing room on Saturday after we got beat, he pulled me aside and he said, "I spoke to Bob Driscoll." He says, and he confirmed what you said, and he said, "Let's forget it and move on," and shook my hand. So he was a great man, but I thought he'd done everything but knock me out. I mean, he was raging. He was absolutely raging, and he had every right to do so.
And then you had a meeting after the FA Cup final called by Don, just to clear the air and to ask players their opinions on how they thought the cup final went, didn't you?
Yeah, well, Don had this. It must have been Don. It was Don's idea, and we was in the dressing room at Highbury, and he just sat us all round. He said, "Look," he says, Saturday wasn't good enough. He said, "I'd like some feedback of how you felt you played and what were the reasons why we played so badly, so poorly. We let the club down and blah blah blah." And he went by and he started with Pat Jennings, and Pat Jennings just shook his head, as he does. Pat, he just sat there and shook his head because he had nothing to say. Pat Jennings was probably the greatest goalkeeper in the world, and he just shook his head and he bypassed Pat as much as say, "That's the way to do it. You're not the problem here." And he went through about 6 or 7 players, and he got to me, and he said, "What do you think?" And he put his hands on the table in the middle of the room, and he looked me straight in the eyes. He said, "What do you think?" I says, "Well, I can only apologise that we didn't play as well as we did, as we could, and I apologise for my performance, I said, "But to be perfectly honest, Don, I don't think it was our fault." I said, "I think it was his fault." And I pointed over his shoulder at Terry Neal. And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, you picked the wrong team." I said, with the greatest respect to Alan Sunderland, I looked at Alan, I said, "This is with the greatest respect, and I think you're a lovely bloke, and you're a good player." I said, "But you shouldn't have been playing." I said, "Graham Rix played really well in the semi-final, and he left him out because he's the youngest one in the squad. So Graham should have played." And Terry Neal flew at me, and he as if he's going to punch me, and all the players jumped up, and Don flew in the middle of us, and Don was laughing, he must say, "Well done." I said, "Well, that's what we need. We need a bit of passion in this dressing room, And so that didn't go down too well. And I remember we trained on the Highbury pitch that day, and I ran out on the field to go training, and all the boys were running up and jumping on my back and patting me on the back and laughing and joking, and said, "God, we've never seen nothing like that. It's about time someone told him, So that was just another nail in the coffin.
So what happened next after that get-together, after that meeting? Because it was, the end of the season, wasn't it? Where did you go after that, and pre-season and then the start of next season, Al?
Well, something went terribly wrong once again. We played in a testimonial on the following Friday at Tottenham for John Pratt. And I remember my best mate at that time, well, it still is really, Tony Davis. He's a mate of mine in London. I said, "I'm going to drive my car to the game," being because it was a testimonial. I said, "I'm going to have a few drinks with the lads after because the season's finished. And you can drive me home and take my car." So he said, "Yeah." Anyway, I parked my car right outside the first car there. Anyway, my mate didn't turn up. for the first time ever, he never turned up for this match. He worked late and didn't make the match. And I went out, had a few drinks with the boys, and I got breathalyzed on the way home and lost my license. And that kind of changed things again. And Don came to court and spoke up for me and said, he was our best player at Wembley last week, and this is tragical, blah blah blah. And the judge just said, look, we should know better, and made an example of me, and he banned me for 3 years. So that was just another problem I had at Arsenal, and I thought, well, things are just not. Everything was going wrong for me there, and that was the final now, I think, and then I fell out with Terry one more time, and I said, that's it, I'm finished, I'm not coming back. And I was out of work for 6 months. I just never went back. And he used to call me and I think the chairman called him in one day. He said, what's happening with this Hudson fella? He said, he hasn't been in. He says, he's still an Arsenal player. I wasn't getting paid. And I just refused to go in because I couldn't take no more of it. And then all of a sudden, I was at Stamford Bridge one day, and Bobby Moore put me on to Seattle, so I had to go. But it was a sad ending to because I really wanted to play well for Arsenal. I really wanted to play for Arsenal, and it's tragic. And I remember speaking to you the other day, so Arsenal fans speak well of me, and I can't understand why, because they never see the best of me. And like the thing with Curry, I mean, as badly as I played, Brady was brilliant, which made me look even worse. So it wasn't a good time for me, really.
But out of all your clubs, because, we help each other with your social media, all fans of all clubs that you've played for view you as an absolute genius and a legend. And I think through these shows as well, which I'm absolutely loving, your humility, your empathy, your honesty just emits through these airwaves, Al.
Well, I think that a lot of people, they got mixed opinions of me. I can understand why a lot of people don't like me, because, and that's why I can't get a job, could never get a job in management, because you can be too honest. You've got to say the things that they want you to say, and I'm not into that. I can honestly say when I write about my best moments in the game, and I can also tell you my worst moments in the game and how badly I played. And I think it's the only way you can be, is completely honest. The players at Stoke, they didn't. There's a few of them didn't really like me because the way I was, because they wasn't used to people like me. They just they were used to people just coming and playing and going home and all that. But I had a lot to say. And unlike the players at Stoke, they had won the League Cup in '72 when they beat us, our Chelsea team, and they played very well and deserved to win. But they forget that I used to laugh at them. I used to say, you can boast all you want about winning the League Cup in '72, but I'd won the FA Cup and the European Cup Winners' Cup when I was 19. Yeah. And I've still got my medal to show it. I said, so don't you be boasting in front of me about beating us at Wembley. It's only the League Cup. But I used to do that just for a gag, Yeah. That was my line with them. And if I do a talk out at night in Stoke, I bring it up and I say, we decided at Chelsea to let them win that game because we beat Leeds in the FA Cup and we beat Real Madrid in the Cup Winners' Cup, so we thought they'd never won nothing. Let's let them win. So, and the Stoke supporters would go nuts, but that was my way of just letting them know, where we stood. Yeah. And that was why when I went to Stoke, I was so confident that I'd played with people like Osgood and Charlie Cook, the two of the greatest players, and nothing, and against I played against Pele at that time. Nothing really fazed me on the football field. The problem I had was my fitness, and I'd been out of the game for a while when I signed for Stoke, but slowly, when I got my fitness, we went from third from bottom when I signed to fifth from top and got into Europe, and I can go up to Stoke now, and they still open doors for me, and I'm quite proud of that because I love playing for them, and I love playing for their fans. They were great fans, and that's why I love playing for the main man, obviously.
Because ultimately, out of all the managers that you've ever had, it is Tony Waddington that is the guy that you absolutely love, adored and cherish playing for, wasn't it?
Oh, well, there couldn't be any other, going back to the jigsaw puzzle, I always say, if I had a jigsaw puzzle, the manager would be Waddington, and the best players and the best fans, the best stadium, whatever, it would always be Waddington. And I thought if I'd never ever played for Tony, I'd love to have played for someone like Jock Stein or Bill Shankly. I don't know if I would have got on with Clough. I don't know. But there's one thing we would have had. We would have had lots of fights, even if it was for fun.
Yeah.
Because I respected the man, but there was nothing like playing for Waddington. He was just a master of his trade, and that's why I say when I met Jock Stein, he just reminded me so much of him, and he had so much experience and knowledge of our game, and there was nothing you could, the discussion, you just listened to him, and because he took so much sense, and at the end of the day, it was probably like Frank Sinatra giving a talk to students of music. Who could argue with Frank? He was just the greatest, and he's simply the best. And I was lucky enough, obviously, to have a great friend in George Best when he lived in Chelsea and around. And we had this great rapport. We had a great friendship, but we never, ever crossed the line. I don't think George and I ever once talked about football. Yeah. Ever. We never did. He was such a lovely, great man. And I find that the greatest... I've always said it, that the greatest people I've met in life, the greater they are at what they do, the greater person they are. And I love the modesty of people like that. And George was a lovely... You wouldn't even know he'd been a footballer, He never spoke about how good he was. He didn't have to. He never spoke about how many Miss Worlds he had or whatever. He was just George, And I just love people like that. So natural, and I think it's the greatest asset any man can have, to be modest.
I agree. A team, though, I think that you would have been brilliant at, would have been, and a manager I'm sure that you'd have loved playing for, would have been Jim Smith at Birmingham, and we'd have loved you. We'd have loved you at St Andrews, mate. You were our kind of player.
Well, I knew Jim. I got to know Jim when he was at Portsmouth with Harry.
Yeah.
And I liked him a lot. He was a true 100% football man. You couldn't fall out with Jim. He liked to drink as well, by the way. Oh. I've had a couple of drinks with him. I found him an absolute toff, a gentleman. Yeah, he knew a good player. And once again, it was all about knowing good players.
Yeah.
And I'm sure if I'd have played for him, he'd got the best out of me. I don't think that we would ever had an argument or a day's problem. Going back to Waddington, I can honestly say I was out of all the, probably, I can count the amount of times on one hand, and I apologised to him without apologising. The only way I could apologise to Tony Waddington was by performing even better, and that's what I did. And that is what it's all about. He didn't mind you crossing the line as long as you did it on a Saturday afternoon. And a great manager would, is that's all they want. A great manager is all they want is that you do it on a Saturday, because that's when the people are in the stadium. That's what they pay their money to see, and they want. But people like Terry Neal are more worried about what you do Monday to Friday, when that didn't count. It really didn't count what you did Monday to Friday. If I was a manager, I wouldn't care what my players done all week, as long as they come in for training and they were sensible. I'm just reading the Gascoigne book, and I met Gazza the other day, and I loved him. I've loved him as a player, and his off-field antics were just outrageous. But you'd have to have him in your team every week, surely.
Quality.
He just the kid. It's a tragic story. I'm just coming to the end of his book, and it's a tragic story of a genius. And Michael Parkinson wrote about me in the Working Man's Ballad. He said the tragic thing about Alan Hudson is we would never know how good he might have been. But a lot to do with that, which Michael didn't know, was my chronic ankle injury that I got in 1970, and that I couldn't play on hard grounds, and I couldn't play my best all season round. But that's not making excuses. That's a fact. But with Gascoigne, who, had he not got them injuries, which he brought on himself, who knows how good he would have become. He was up there, with all the greats of all time.
Certainly was. And another great of all time, Duncan Edwards. And there's a meal for Duncan at the Copthorne Hotel in Dudley, just by the Mary Hill Shopping Centre. And you are invited, mate. I think it's October the 11th. I'll check the date. So if you want to come up to Birmingham, there's quite a lot in the Midlands regarding Duncan Edwards, because they're trying to keep that memory of arguably the greatest British player of all time alive, and one of the greatest the world's ever seen.
Well, yeah, that's another. I think that's just another mystery of life that we will never know. People talk about John Charles. Yeah. They said this fella might have been greater. Who knows? We never know. I think the other tragedy was I tried to get hold of about 20 odd year ago. Me and my friend Martin Knight, we tried to get hold of Peter Knowles.
Another legend.
And I wanted to write a book about Peter. Me and Martin wanted to write a book about Peter Knowles, and I tried to contact him. He was stacking shelves in Sainsbury's or Tesco somewhere up in the Midlands, and I tried to get hold of him. I couldn't get hold of him. Who knows? It's another mystery. It's how good would he have been had he not done something outrageous like become a Jehovah? Yeah. It's just life is just. I didn't really see it. I never played against him. He's just before me, but surely would have been. Well, I don't think Alf would have picked him in the 60s. He had too much flair for Alf. But surely it must have been one of the best players in the country at that time. I spoke to Dugan once about him. He said he was a total genius. Yeah. Who knows how good he would have become. These are all the great things about what you do on the radio and everything else, to discuss these things and keep their... that's why I love talking about Waddingham, because I love to keep people alive, which we always do, especially great people. We don't talk about people we don't like and people that are not really that good as a person or as a player, not worth talking about, basically. But geniuses come along very, very rarely, and I was very fortunate to see Gazza the other day, and he hugged me. We hugged each other because it was as if we'd been friends for all our lives, and because it all came about. My nephew was at Tottenham for a little while, and the Venables, my brother's son, and young Billy Hudson, and he walked in with my top on one day. I had a coaching school, and Gascoigne. This is what Billy says. He says Gascoigne was on the treatment table, and he said, "Who's that on the back of your jumper?" He said, "That's my uncle." He said, "But who is it?" And he told him who it was, and he said he got off the bench and he bowed down to him. No, I don't know if that's a true story, because Billy can tell a good story. And I don't know if that hug the other day was anything to do with that. But I just said to him, mate, what a pleasure, I really wanted to meet Gascoigne as well, because everybody I've ever spoke to said he's such a lovely fella, and that's the way he came across. And it's painful to read his book, because his big problem is he never grew up.
Yep.
That's not a bad thing in people. It's good not to want to grow up, but his emotions took over him at certain times when they shouldn't. Like the tackle against Italy and things like that. And that's a genius. What do you do? That's they say in life, all these geniuses, whether it's Elvis or whoever, James Dean, I don't know. There's always that dividing line,
I've said that from probably pretty much our first conversations. The thing is with you guys, and I class you as a genius as well, and I think most football fans would, is that your brains are wired different to the likes of everyday people. And when you can go on a football pitch and produce, or on a stage and produce the magic that a certain select few can do, why would we necessarily think then when you're off the pitch, you're off the stage, you're going to act like everybody else? Because you're not. You are geniuses, and you were put down on this planet to give pleasure to lots of people through music, through dance, through football, through golf or boxing, whatever your sport is, and that's what you do better than anybody else, mate.
Well, I think there's a lot to be said. You know when you meet people if they're a bit special. I mean, I remember the last time I see Bobby Moore, bless him. He was with Phil Collins, and I went backstage to see Phil because my mate used to work with Phil, and I knew Phil, and I was taken aback. He was standing looking at Bobby Moore in awe, because he loves his football, Phil. And I can remember, and I said to my friend, "Don't go over there yet. Look at this. Look at the way Phil's looking at him, And they're two special people together, and you can tell they were two superstars. Mm. Just by looking at them, you could tell they weren't ordinary people. Yep. There's the way Bobby held himself, and although I think he died a couple of weeks later, Bobby, and although he looked gaunt and ill, he still was immaculate and looked special. Like that silly thing that the Roger Moore thing, the Saint, when the thing comes above his head. Bobby was like that. Bobby was like that. He was, you just looked at him, and he had that certain aura about him. He was just a special man. As I say, the greater the player, or the greater whatever they do, the greater the person. I've never met a nicer man than Bobby Moore.